A major compensation lawsuit involving what used to be known as Indian day schools faces a hurdle today. The proposed settlement, part of a nationwide class action lawsuit against the Government of Canada. A court in Winnipeg today will consider payouts to any survivors of abuse at the federally funded schools, but not all of those survivors agree on the details of the deal. Michael Serapio is in to explain. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Heather, and very interesting court case as it proceeds right now in Winnipeg. And as you say, this is an important settlement. In fact, it was widely celebrated when it was originally announced back in March. And really, it's the end and the culmination of a class action lawsuit that was launched in 2009. And ahead of that going to court, the federal government did settle with a group of Indian day school survivors. And here are the details of the deal. Survivors of Indian day schools will be eligible for $10,000 in individual compensation. Those who survive physical and sexual abuse will then be eligible for an additional $50,000 to $200,000, depending on each individual case. And in addition to that, the federal government will set aside $200 million that will be used for what's described as healing, education, language, culture, and commemoration legacy projects. All of this meant to foster further reconciliation, acknowledging the hundreds of thousands of students who attended Indian day schools beginning in 1920, students who were First Nation, Métis, Inuit, abused and harmed by those who were meant to take care of them. Now, these are also survivors, we need to point out, that were not included in 2006, that settlement that was brokered in part by the Harper government, because that 2006 settlement only really covered survivors of residential schools. And even the historic apology that we heard in the House of Commons only covered residential school survivors, not day school survivors. There are many more day school students historically in this country. All of this deal that is meant to address all of this will go before that judge, and that judge will either decide that this deal will go through, which means compensation can begin in a matter of months, or it will be sent back to the drawing board.
So obviously, for those waiting, there are a lot of high stakes in this matter. There are survivors by the hundreds, Michael, who don't like this settlement, don't like some of the details. What are their main concerns?
Well, it really has to do with the compensation program itself, because as I say, if it goes through, it will be months. But in order to qualify, people need to fill out an application form. They have to do so within a calendar year. The complainants would like that timeline to be expanded. They also point out that those that apply may not be able to fill out the forms. It's about 11 pages, we hear. The government says it's simple, straightforward, but the complainants say not necessarily so for everyone, especially those who live in remote areas, those who may be illiterate. And so they also want more money to help pay for legal fees, in addition to some further compensation as well, Heather.
Michael, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Beginning our conversation there, and we'll have more on the story later in the hour. One of our top stories, as we've been covering all morning, the 3 days of hearings in a major compensation lawsuit that begin today in Winnipeg. This is a case that centers on survivors of what were known then as Indian day schools, different from the residential school system, which is a key distinguishing feature because not part as a result of the settlement involving the residential schools. These operated outside for more than a century, right across Canada. Back in March, the federal government and the survivors reached a deal. And that is what is moving through the federal court now at the proceedings. It's to get to the details of that compensation plan. One of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit is Marielle Buckshot. Her father attended one of the schools, and Marielle is my guest this morning from Winnipeg. Ms. Buckshot, thank you for being a guest on our program today.
Thank you for having me this morning.
I mentioned your father, who attended one of these schools in the Outaouais region north of Ottawa. Can you give me a little bit of a sense of what he experienced at that school?
He, over the years, didn't mention too much, but he would jokingly say things about the things he saw and he endured at the schools, in the day school. Over the years, I've come to learn that he not only dealt with physical abuse, but he also had to deal with sexual abuse, which led him to quit school when he was in grade 4.
So he dealt with all of the worst aspects of this as a young boy. And then, of course, you as his daughter would have dealt with the after effects. What was the ongoing impact on you, Marielle?
The ongoing impact was the way he raised us, the certain rules he set upon in our house, which to me at the time seemed hypocritical. He wanted us to keep our language and our culture, even though he went through that system, and I myself going through provincial school and seeing racism myself. I wondered why is he raising us this way? There's and the other factors of the abuses he encountered, he also practiced in his adult life.
And so we understand why you're one of the people looking for compensation in all of this through the legal action. And as I mentioned, survivors like you and your father and the government agreed to a deal in March. Today, you look into the details. How significant is this phase?
This phase is very, very important to me and all of the Anishinaabe people across Canada. It's the recognition, the wrongs done to our people from back then with the assimilation process. Let's assimilate the native people. Let's take what's theirs. It's very important. I'm so glad to be here in Winnipeg to go through the 3 days court hearings and get a final okay, and somewhere down the road, hopefully an apology too.
What the judge is looking at, these terms, anywhere from $10,000 up to $200,000 per survivor. It's this big range. Why do you support the deal as it has been struck so far?
It's not the compensation that we look at. We're going to accept it, but it's the fact that it's recognized that there were problems. We had to deal with a lot of problems as Native people from back in history. And it doesn't seem much to some. It may seem a whole lot to others. And then the extra $200 million set aside for commemorations, for healing, for culture and language, to retain and sustain our being of who we are, Anishinaabe people.
There are many people, in fact hundreds, and we understand even maybe thousands of survivors of the day schools who object to the framework that's been reached so far, and they see the timeline of a year as being too tight, and they see all the forms that people have to fill out as being too complicated. I mean, what do you feel about their objections to this? Because they're going to argue it in court today too.
Yes, I could understand. They have their objections. I myself seen some of the forms that have been filled out, and they are not as complicated as they seem to be. In my community, I'm helping my people with the forms as simple as they may be.
So that's what some of their lawyers have told us at CBC News, that the forms are 11 pages and they're too complicated for maybe people who are in remote areas, perhaps illiterate, and they'll need a lot more help to get it done in a year's time. I'm wondering if, so you think it's not as serious as they say on the other side, but what if this snarls the whole thing up and you have to go right back to the start again of this process?
It would be dreadful to go through the whole process once again. I'll be honest. The forms may be difficult for those that are isolated or illiterate. I know there is help through Gowling, WLG Gowling. They have lawyers and employees there that are more than willing to help anyone that has complications.
So there are places to turn for people who may need help.
Yes.
What will it mean to you and to your father to have this settled?
It'd be a closure for us. A healing, the beginning to heal, but a closure. To close this book, this chapter of the history.
We'll be paying really close attention to these 3 days, Mariette, and I thank you very much for giving us time to begin our coverage.
You're welcome.
Marielle Buckshot, one of the lead plaintiffs in the case going to federal court in Winnipeg today.